The wagon wheel snapped clean off the axle just 3 miles outside of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, and Etta Hawthorne decided right then and there that the universe had a particular and personal grudge against her. She sat on the buckboard for a long moment, her 2-year-old twins miraculously still asleep in the wagon bed behind her despite the lurch and the crack and the terrible grinding halt. The afternoon sun was beating down like it meant to flatten everything beneath it, and the road ahead stretched out in a pale, dusty ribbon toward a town she'd never been to, toward a life she hadn't yet figured out how to build. She pressed her lips together, breathed in slowly through her nose, and then climbed down from the buckboard to assess the damage. It was worse than she'd feared. The rear left wheel had not merely come loose. The iron tire had separated from the wooden felloe, and 2 of the spokes had cracked straight through. The axle itself had taken the impact and now sat at a dejected angle that told her plainly the wagon was not going anywhere under its own power. She stood in the red Texas dust in her worn brown dress, her dark hair pinned up but coming loose at the temples, and she looked at the wreckage and she thought about crying. She decided against it. She had done enough crying in the past year to last her a lifetime. Clara and Caleb were still sleeping. 4.5 months ago she had been a wife. Now she was a widow with 2 toddlers, $43 in a tin box beneath the wagon seat, a broken-down conveyance, and a letter in her apron pocket that gave her the name and location of the only person left in the world who might be willing to help her. The letter was from her late husband's cousin, a woman named Margaret Gruber, who had written to say that she'd settled near Dusty Creek and that the land out there was cheap and the people were decent enough. Margaret had offered to let Etta and the children stay with her family while Etta got on her feet. That offer had kept Etta going through the worst of the grief and through the long, rattling journey from Missouri that had taken 2.5 weeks and felt like 2.5 years. But Margaret's farm was still 3 miles off, and the wagon was broken, and the twins were asleep, and Etta was standing alone on a dirt road in Texas with the sun trying to murder her. She heard the hammer before she saw the house. A steady, rhythmic sound drifting from somewhere behind a line of scrubby mesquite trees, about 200 yards to the east. She shaded her eyes with her hand and looked. Through the trees she could make out the shape of a low wooden structure, a barn or workshop of some kind, and beyond it the roofline of a house. A proper house, not a soddy, with a covered porch and what looked like glass in the windows. She looked at her sleeping children. She looked at the broken wagon. She considered her $43 and the 3 miles still between her and any certainty. Then she picked up her skirts, walked 200 yards through scrub grass and heat shimmer, climbed over a split-rail fence that marked the edge of a well-kept property, and followed the sound of the hammer to the open doors of the largest, most impressively outfitted workshop she had ever seen outside of a proper smithy in town. The man inside had his back to her. He was working at a long wooden bench, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his dark hair damp with sweat at the back of his neck. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, and he moved with the kind of efficient, unhurried economy that spoke of a man who had done this particular task 1,000 times before. There were tools hanging on the wall behind him in careful rows, everything from small farrier's tools to a full-sized bellows forge in the corner. The air smelled of iron and sawdust and linseed oil. "Excuse me," she said. He did not drop the hammer or spin around in alarm, which told her he had heard her coming. He set the hammer down deliberately on the bench, turned around with equal deliberateness, and looked at her. He was younger than she'd anticipated. Not a graybeard, not a grizzled old-timer. He was somewhere around 30, she guessed, with a face that was clean-shaved and weather-browned, with dark eyes that were doing a very careful, very thorough job of taking her in without appearing to be impolite about it. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she said back. "I am sorry to come onto your property without an invitation. My name is Etta Hawthorne, and I have broken down on the road approximately 200 yards west of your fence line. My wagon wheel has failed entirely, and I have 2 small children asleep in the back of that wagon. I am wondering if you might know of a wheelwright in Dusty Creek who could help me, or if you have any means of transporting me and my children to the Gruber farm, which I understand to be about 3 miles north." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her in the direction of the road. "How bad is the wheel?" he asked. "The iron tire has separated and 2 spokes are broken through. The axle may be compromised as well." He picked up his hat from a peg near the bench and put it on, and she noticed that it was a good hat, a serious hat, dark felt and well-shaped, the kind that cost real money. He walked out of the workshop past her without another word, and she followed him back through the scrub grass to the road. He crouched down beside the damaged wheel for a long time without saying anything. He ran his hands along the axle, checked the wheel hub, examined the separated tire with the focused attention of a physician examining a wound. Then he stood up, pushed his hat back on his head, and looked at her. "Axle is sound," he said. "Wheel I can fix. It'll take most of the afternoon." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You didn't ask me," he said. "I offered." She wanted to argue. The part of her that had spent the last 4 months doing everything herself, needing no one, accepting no charity, bristled instinctively. But Clara made a small sound in the wagon bed just then, the soft preliminary sound that always preceded her waking up, and Caleb stirred beside her, and Etta thought of 3 miles of road and a broken axle and $43. "I would pay you," she said. "Whatever is fair." He shook his head once. "No need. I am Jeremiah Lockhart. That is my property." He nodded toward the house and the workshop. "You are welcome to bring the children inside while I work. My housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, will give them something cold to drink." Etta Hawthorne stood in the dust of that Texas road in 1882 and looked at Jeremiah Lockhart, and something in her chest shifted in a way she did not immediately understand and would not have admitted to under interrogation. She put it aside. She had a wagon to fix and children to feed and a life to reconstruct from its scattered pieces. "Thank you," she said. Clara and Caleb woke fully as she was lifting them down from the wagon, which they did with the cheerful, instantaneous consciousness of all small children, going from deep sleep to complete alertness in the space of a breath. Clara was the older of the 2 by 11 minutes, and she conducted herself accordingly, immediately pointing at Jeremiah Lockhart and announcing, "Man," with the authoritative satisfaction of someone completing a difficult identification. "That is correct," Etta told her. Caleb reached out toward the broken wheel with both hands and said, "Broke," which was also correct. Jeremiah Lockhart looked at the twins with an expression that Etta could not quite read. Not discomfort, not the falsely enthusiastic performance that some men produced in the presence of small children. Something quieter and more genuine than either. He crouched down so he was at eye level with them, which she had not expected. "You have a good eye," he told Caleb. "It is indeed broke. I am going to fix it." Caleb looked at him with the profound seriousness of a 2-year-old considering an important matter, and then nodded once as if granting permission. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, was a stout Mexican woman of about 55 with silver-streaked black hair, and the quiet, competent manner of someone who had seen everything and found most of it manageable. She welcomed Etta and the children onto the covered porch and produced cups of cool well water and a tin of molasses cookies, and she did all of this with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a woman who was good at her work and had no interest in making a performance of it. The house itself was clean and solid and entirely without decoration, which told Etta something. No curtains at the windows, no needlepoint on the walls, no woman's hand evident anywhere in the furnishings. Just good, sturdy furniture and a bare-swept floor and the functional order of a man living alone. "Mr. Lockhart is not married," she said to Mrs. Alvarez, and then immediately wished she hadn't, because it sounded like something she had been wanting to ask. Mrs. Alvarez handed Caleb another molasses cookie with perfect equanimity. "He was once," she said. 3 years past now." Etta did not ask what had happened. The level finality of Mrs. Alvarez's tone made it clear that the matter was closed. She sat on the porch and watched the twins eat their cookies and make friends with a yellow dog who had appeared from somewhere around the back of the house, and she listened to the sounds coming from the direction of the road. The measured strikes of a hammer, the hiss of the forge, the particular scrape of iron being worked. It was, she realized, a deeply reassuring sound, the sound of something broken being mended. She thought about her husband, Thomas. He had been a good man, not a remarkable one, but a genuinely good one, and he had died of a fever in November, so quickly that she had barely had time to understand what was happening before it was over. He had been 28 years old. She had been 26. The twins had been 14 months, old enough to walk but not old enough to understand why their father was no longer there. Grief was a strange country, she had found. You walked through it and it changed around you as you went, and sometimes you could not tell if you were making progress or simply wandering in circles. She was 27 now. The children were 2. She had in her possession the sum of $43, a letter from Margaret Gruber, and whatever she could build with her own 2 hands. She would not think about the way Jeremiah Lockhart had looked at her. She would certainly not think about the way he had crouched down to be at eye level with Caleb. From the road came the steady percussion of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It was past 4 o'clock in the afternoon before Jeremiah Lockhart walked back up to the porch, his hands dark with grease and his shirt damp through with sweat, and informed her that the wheel was repaired and the wagon was ready to travel. "You worked for 4 hours," she said. "The tire needed resetting and one of the hub bolts was stripped. I replaced it." He said this without particular emphasis, as if replacing hub bolts was a natural and unremarkable part of anyone's afternoon. He accepted the cup of water Mrs. Alvarez handed him and drank most of it before lowering it. Etta had her purse in her hand. "Please tell me what I owe you." "I told you nothing, Mr. Lockhart." "Mrs. Hawthorne." They looked at each other. The twins were in the yard below the porch, engaged in some collaborative project involving the yellow dog and a stick. "That is several hours of skilled labor," she said, "and materials." "I had the materials on hand." He did not appear to be uncomfortable with the disagreement, merely patient with it in the manner of a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. "You are traveling alone with 2 small children. I am not going to charge you for helping you. I do not accept charity." Something shifted in his expression, not offense, not impatience, something more considered than either. "It is not charity," he said. "You are a neighbor in need on a bad road with 2 children. Helping you is not charity. It is what a person does." She wanted to argue further, but the simple, unshakable decency of what he'd said made further argument feel small and ungrateful. She put her purse away. "Then thank you," she said. "Genuinely," he nodded. Clara had discovered the porch steps and was attempting to climb them in reverse, which was a project she accomplished with great determination and not very much technique. Without any apparent self-consciousness, Jeremiah stepped off the porch and reached down and set her right way round on the bottom step, and Clara looked up at him with the severe evaluative gaze unique to 2-year-olds and then said, "Again," and turned around to climb back down. A sound escaped Etta before she could stop it, something between a laugh and a breath. Jeremiah looked up at her from the yard below, and for just a moment something in his face opened up. Just for a moment. Then he straightened and picked up his hat from where it had been resting on the porch rail. "The Gruber farm is 3 miles north, then west at the Cottonwood Grove," he said. "You will see the windmill from the road." "Thank you," she said again. "I mean that." She gathered her children and her belongings and drove the repaired wagon north toward the Gruber farm, and she told herself very firmly that she was not going to think about Jeremiah Lockhart. She thought about him for 3 miles. Margaret Gruber was a robust German-American woman of 35 who hugged Etta with both arms the moment she stepped down from the wagon, and then immediately started crying and scolding her in equal measure for taking so long to arrive, and for arriving with a broken wagon, and for looking so thin and pale. "You need feeding," Margaret announced, steering Etta toward the house with a hand on her back as her husband, Werner, unhitched the horses with the practiced quiet of a man long accustomed to letting his wife conduct the reception of guests. "You need sleep and you need feeding and those babies need. We met a man," Clara announced to Margaret with the same declarative confidence she had used for the wheel identification. "Did you?" said Margaret and looked at Etta. "My wheel broke," Etta said. "A neighbor helped me repair it, a Mr. Lockhart." Margaret stopped walking. "Jeremiah Lockhart fixed your wheel. He did. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing wrong." Margaret was looking at her with an expression that Etta recognized and did not care for, a particular combination of speculation and satisfaction. "He is a good man, keeps to himself mostly," since she paused. "Since he lost his wife." Mrs. Alvarez mentioned that. "Eleanor Lockhart died in childbirth in 1879. The baby, too." Margaret said it quietly, with the matter-of-fact sorrow of a woman who lived close to the realities of frontier life. "He has not been the same since, from what people say." Etta filed that away somewhere and did not examine it. Werner and Margaret had 4 children of their own, ranging from 5 to 12, and those children regarded the twins with great delight and adopted them immediately into their household company. The Gruber farm was prosperous and cheerful and overwhelmingly generous, and that first evening, sitting at a table that was almost buckling under the weight of the food on it, surrounded by children and warmth and the sound of Werner's low-voiced stories, Etta felt something in her chest ease by approximately 1 degree. She would make this work. She had always made things work. In the days that followed, she learned the landscape of her new circumstances. The town of Dusty Creek was 3 miles south, a proper little western town with a general store, a post office, a doctor's office, a church, a schoolhouse, and 2 saloons that faced each other across the main street like old enemies who had agreed to a truce. The land around it was cattle country mostly, with a few farms, and the population was a mix of long-established Anglo-ranching families, Mexican-American families who had been there longer than anyone else, and newer arrivals like Margaret and Werner who had come west looking for land and opportunity. There was work to be had. Margaret knew a dressmaker in town who needed help, a woman named Mrs. Pierce whose eyesight was failing and whose hands were stiff with arthritis. The work would not make Etta wealthy, but it would give her income, and Margaret had already begun talking about a small parcel of land adjacent to the Gruber farm that might be for sale at a price Etta could eventually afford. Eventually was a long way off, but eventually was something. She had been at the Gruber farm for 9 days when she saw Jeremiah Lockhart again. She was coming out of the general store in Dusty Creek with Clara and Caleb attached to her hands like particularly determined anchors, her arms full of a package of dress goods for Mrs. Pierce, and she walked directly into his path on the boardwalk. He stopped, she stopped. Clara and Caleb looked up at him. "Man," said Clara. "Broke," said Caleb, which was not accurate in this instance but reflected his recent enthusiasms. A corner of Jeremiah's mouth moved. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "you made it to the Grubers all right." "We did, thank you. We have settled in well, and the wagon is still holding together before you ask." "I was not going to ask," he said. "My work holds." There was not the slightest boast in it, just simple truth. She had the feeling that Jeremiah Lockhart said exactly what he meant and not a syllable more, which she found both refreshing and slightly unnerving, as she had spent 2 weeks now carefully saying much less than she meant. "I hear you do wheelwright work for the whole county," she said. "Wagon repair mostly, blacksmithing. I have a contract with the stage line." He shifted the box he was carrying from one arm to the other. "Keeps me occupied." "I imagine it does." They stood on the boardwalk in the late May sunshine, and the ordinary commerce of Dusty Creek moved around them, horses and wagons and townspeople conducting their business, and Etta found that she could not immediately locate a good reason to walk away. "How are you finding the area?" he asked. The question was politely neutral, but she had the sense that he was actually asking it, not merely saying words to fill silence. "It is very different from Missouri," she said. Everything is bigger and flatter and hotter, and the sky is—" she paused. "The sky is extraordinary, actually. I did not expect that." Something in his expression softened slightly. "I know what you mean," he said. "I came from Virginia 8 years ago. The sky is the thing that stays with you." Virginia. She would not have guessed that. He did not have the accent. "What brought you out here?" she asked, and then caught herself. "Forgive me, that is too personal a question from someone you have met once." "We have met twice," he said, "and it is a natural question to ask anyone in Texas." He adjusted the box again. "Land. I wanted to build something, my own land, my own work." "Did you find what you were looking for?" He considered the question with the same unhurried deliberateness he seemed to bring to everything. "Some of it," he said. Clara, who had the conversational timing of a stage actress, chose this moment to tug on Etta's hand and announce that she needed the privy urgently, an announcement that immediately transformed the entire scene from quiet contemplation to purposeful motion. "Excuse me," Etta said, and Jeremiah stepped aside and touched his hat brim in the way that men in this country did, and she corralled both twins and her package and headed down the boardwalk at a pace that was not quite running. She was 3 stores down when she heard him behind her. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she turned. "The privy is back that way," he said, pointing. She had been walking in entirely the wrong direction. She felt her face do something warm and inconvenient. "Thank you," she said. Again. He walked away in the opposite direction, and she could not tell from the back whether he was smiling. June came in hot and dry and loaded with the smell of dry grass and distant thunderstorms that promised rain and rarely delivered. Etta was working 4 days a week at Mrs. Pierce's dressmaking shop, learning the particular likes and dislikes of Dusty Creek's female population, and becoming, slowly and incrementally, part of the fabric of the town. The twins spent those 4 days with Margaret, who had declared loudly that 2 extra babies were no additional trouble whatsoever, a claim that her own 5 children regarded with visible skepticism. She saw Jeremiah Lockhart with some regularity, because in a town of 400 people in 1882, that was simply what happened. They had a way of running into each other at the general store, at the church on Sundays, on the road between town and the outlying properties. They had fallen into a habit of conversation when they met that was courteous and interesting and absolutely nothing else, and Etta had decided this was both appropriate and preferable. She had decided this particularly firmly on the Sunday morning in late June when she noticed, during the church service, that he had come in late and taken a seat in the pew immediately behind her, and that she was aware of his presence there with a sensitivity that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with her own inconvenient nervous system. She had sung the hymns with greater emphasis than usual and spent the sermon staring at the front of the church, with a concentration that Reverend Mills might have found gratifying if he'd known it had nothing to do with his sermon. After the service, as the congregation gathered in the churchyard in the way that was the real social purpose of Sunday services in a small town, she found herself talking to Jeremiah and a rancher named Pete Halloran about whether the summer would bring the drought everyone was nervous about. And she found herself watching the way Jeremiah talked, the careful precision of his words, the way he listened with his full attention, and not just the parts of it he wasn't using to plan what he'd say next. His wife had died in childbirth in 1879. He had come from Virginia to build something. He lived alone in a well-kept house with Mrs. Alvarez and a yellow dog. She stopped herself from cataloging these facts as if they were things she needed. She had a life to build. She had $43, now supplemented by her wages, becoming something more like a real sum. She had the twins, who were 2 years old and relentlessly alive and funny and exhausting, and the entire architecture of her world. She did not need anything that she did not already have. She was very nearly convinced of this. The crisis came on a Wednesday in July that started out ordinary and became the worst day she had experienced since Thomas died, which was a statement she would not have made lightly. She had been at Mrs. Pierce's shop until midday, working on a complicated bodice alteration that required both concentration and patience, when Werner Gruber arrived at the door of the shop with the flat expression of a man carrying bad news. It was Caleb. He had been running in the yard and had fallen badly, and he had hurt his arm, and Margaret had taken him to Dr. Hennessy, who was now saying it might be broken. Etta did not run in the street because she had been taught not to, but she walked with a speed that made running academic, and she arrived at Dr. Hennessy's office to find her son sitting on the examination table with his left arm splinted and his small face tear-streaked, and Clara sitting in a chair beside him holding his free hand with an expression of grave sisterly solidarity. "Clean break," said Dr. Hennessy, who was a compact, capable man with a Boston education and a frontier matter-of-factness. "Right below the elbow. He will be in the splint for 6 weeks. After that, complete recovery, no reason to expect any lasting difficulty." Etta sat down on the chair beside Clara's chair and held both of her children's hands and breathed. "He cried," Clara told her, in a tone that was both informative and compassionate. "I imagine he did," said Etta. "I cried also," Clara added, apparently feeling this was important context. "You are both very brave," Etta said, and her voice only bent slightly on the last word. She was paying Dr. Hennessy, doing the arithmetic in her head that had become as automatic and constant as breathing, when she heard the office door open behind her and turned to find Jeremiah Lockhart standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "I heard in the street," he said. "Mrs. Alvarez was in the store and she heard. I was just finishing at the smithy." He looked at Caleb on the examination table. "How bad?" "Broken arm," she said. "He will be fine." Caleb looked at Jeremiah with the serious appraisal of a child who remembered a man who had fixed a wheel. "Broke," he said, lifting his splinted arm. "I see that," said Jeremiah. "Same as the wheel, I fixed that. The doctor fixed you. Between us, we can fix about anything." He looked at Caleb with such uncomplicated, steady warmth that Etta felt something happen in her chest that was entirely outside her control. He stayed while she settled the children and gathered her things. He walked out of the office with her. He walked with her to where Werner was waiting with the wagon to take her and the children back to the farm, and he helped lift Caleb up with a care that was so automatic and unself-conscious that she had the distinct impression he was not thinking about being kind, he was simply being it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You did not have to." "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Werner sat on the wagon seat with the diplomatic blankness of a man who was looking at the horizon. "Jeremiah," she said, because she had never said his given name before and she was not entirely sure why she was saying it now. He looked at her steadily. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "Any time," he said, and then more quietly so that Werner could not hear, "Any time you need help. That is not charity. That is what a neighbor is for." He turned and walked back the way he had come, and Etta watched him go, and Werner very carefully continued to look at the horizon. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Margaret Gruber sat across from Etta at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the direct, undecorated honesty that was one of the things Etta had come to love about her. "Jeremiah Lockhart came to check on you today," Margaret said. "He came to check on Caleb," Etta said. "He came because you were there," Margaret said. "I have lived near that man for 3 years and he has never once come running to anyone's emergency at a doctor's office." "Margaret, I am simply telling you what I observed. I am aware of what you are implying." "Good." Margaret drank her coffee. "Then I will only say this once more and then hold my tongue for as long as I can manage, which with you may not be long. He is a good man. He is lonely in a way he does not know how to speak about. And you, Etta Hawthorne, are hiding behind your practical sensibilities because you are afraid. And I do not blame you for being afraid. But I will not let you hide from something good without at least telling you plainly that it is there." Etta was quiet for a while. "He fixed my wagon," she said finally. "Yes," said Margaret, "he did. He barely knows me." "You barely know him," said Margaret. "That is what changing is. Etta picked up her coffee cup. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and full of cricket sound. "Hold your tongue," she said. Margaret smiled. "As long as I can manage," she agreed. She did not go looking for opportunities to spend time with Jeremiah Lockhart. She told herself this firmly. But the summer had its own logic, and the town of Dusty Creek was small, and there were only so many hours in a week. He came to the Gruber farm on a Saturday in late July to look at Werner's wagon, which had developed a creak that Werner was convinced was ominous. Etta was in the yard hanging washing when he arrived, the twins running in circles around her feet with the perpetual motion energy of 2-year-olds, and she watched him shake hands with Werner and walk over to examine the wagon with the same focused attention he brought to everything mechanical. "It is the reach bolt," she heard him say to Werner. 2 minutes. She went back to her washing. She was very deliberately not watching him. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he called, without looking up from where he was crouched under the wagon. "Yes." "Is that peach tree near the porch the one Mrs. Gruber is planning to dry for winter?" She looked at the peach tree. "I have no idea," she said. "Why are you asking me about a peach tree while you are under a wagon?" "I can do 2 things at once," he said. She heard the particular sound of a bolt being tightened. She laughed. It was the first real, unguarded laugh that had come out of her since Thomas died, and it surprised her enough that she put her hand over her mouth. Jeremiah emerged from under the wagon with a wrench in his hand and looked at her, and she could see that he had heard the surprise in it too, the quality of a sound that had not been planned. "The peach tree is a good one," he said, as if this required saying. "In another month it will need harvesting." "I am sure Margaret knows that," she said. Her voice was steady again. "Right." He stood up and wiped the wrench on a piece of rag. "Bolt is done. Tell Werner it will hold." He did not leave immediately. He stayed to talk with Werner about the pasture fencing. And then Clara attached herself to his leg with both arms and refused to release him, which was a social situation he handled with remarkable composure, walking calmly across the yard with a 2-year-old attached to his ankle as if this were perfectly normal. Caleb, his arm still splinted, watched this with critical interest and then announced, "Me too," and attached himself to the other ankle. Jeremiah looked down at the pair of them. "Caleb," he said, "your arm." "Is fine," said Caleb, with the certainty of a 2-year-old whose definition of fine was extremely flexible. Etta came and detached them both, one at a time, and Jeremiah endured the detachment process with a patience that was, she reflected, either genuine or a very convincing performance. "They like you," she said, more surprised than she meant to let on. "I like them," he said. This was said with the same plainness that characterized everything he said, no performance of affection, just the simple statement of a fact. He looked at her. "They are good children. You should be proud." She had heard variations of this phrase from many people over the course of the last 9 months, and it had always felt slightly like condolence, slightly like a consolation prize. From him, said in that unadorned, direct way, it felt like what it was, a man who had paid attention and was reporting what he'd found. "I am," she said. "Very." He put his hat on and climbed onto his horse, a bay gelding that was as businesslike and well-kept as everything else in his life, and he touched his hat brim to her and rode back down the road, and she stood in the yard with peach tree light going gold behind her and thought, "I am in trouble." She thought it with full clarity, for the first time, without argument or qualification. Then she went back to her washing. August burned down through the days like a slow fire. Etta found herself settling into Dusty Creek, with the particular combination of grit and gradual ease that the frontier required. She knew most of the town now, knew which merchants were honest and which were not, knew which women in the church were kind and which were curious in the unkind way. She was saving money steadily. The land adjacent to the Grubers was still available and still potentially within reach of what she could manage, if she was careful, and if the dressmaking income held. She had supper with Jeremiah Lockhart on the 14th of August. This was not planned, or rather it was planned but only by Margaret, who had invited him to a Saturday supper at the Gruber farm along with several other neighbors, with the transparent and cheerful strategy of a woman who had decided she could no longer hold her tongue. Etta, who had not been consulted on the guest list, arrived at the supper table to find him already seated between Pete Halloran and the Gruber's oldest boy, eating Margaret's bread with the look of a man who had recently remembered that food was something he enjoyed. She sat down across from him and composed herself. It was the longest conversation they had yet had. 2 hours of supper at a crowded table with children and neighbors and Werner's quiet humor and Margaret's excellent cooking. And somehow, between the passing of dishes and the noise of 4 Gruber children and the twins attempting to feed themselves with escalating ambition, she and Jeremiah had managed to have a real conversation. About Virginia, where he had grown up the second of 5 children on a farm that had nearly been bankrupted by the aftermath of the war, and his father's stubborn refusal to adapt. About Missouri, where she had grown up in a house full of books because her father had been a school teacher and considered literacy a form of self-defense. About the way the West had looked to both of them before they came here and how it looked different once you were in it, less romantic and more real and somehow better for being real. What I did not expect, she said, was how much I would need to learn. I thought I was a capable person. I had managed a household. I had managed children. And then I arrived in Texas and discovered that I did not know how to do almost anything that Texas required. What did you learn first? He asked. How to not panic when a scorpion comes out from under the water bucket, she said. I considered that a significant achievement. Pete Halloran laughed at that. Jeremiah smiled, the full version of it, and she realized she had only seen pieces of it before. The full version changed his face considerably. What else? He asked. That the sky at night here is something you have to sit down for, she said. The first time I went outside after dark and saw it properly, I had to sit on the porch steps because I was not prepared for how much of it there was. What did you think? He was looking at her with an attention that was not like being examined, more like being listened to. I thought, she said, that it looked like freedom. She paused, which is strange, considering that I had just buried my husband and lost most of what I knew. But that is what it looked like. The table had gone slightly quieter around them, not eavesdropping, just the natural acoustic adjustment of a group of people recognizing that something real was being said. Jeremiah said, "That is exactly what it is." She looked at him across the dishes and the candle and the cheerful evidence of the Gruber's household and thought, I am no longer approaching trouble. I have arrived. He helped Werner move some fence lumber after supper while the women cleaned up, and when he came in to say good night, he paused at the kitchen door. Margaret was in the other room. Etta was at the wash basin, and the twins were long asleep, and the lamp was burning low. Thank you for the supper, he said. That is Margaret's credit, not mine. I know, he said, but you were here. She turned from the basin and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, just as he had been at the doctor's office in July, and she thought about how many times she had seen him with his hat in his hands, which was what happened when a man who wore his hat as a matter of course took it off as a matter of respect. Good night, Jeremiah, she said. Good night, Etta, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. After he left, she stood at the wash basin for a long time without washing anything. The conversation she had been putting off with herself happened on a Sunday morning in early September, in the small room she shared with the twins at the Gruber farm, while the children were still asleep, and the house was just beginning to stir with Werner's early morning sounds from the kitchen below. She sat on the edge of her bed and was honest with herself. She had loved Thomas. She had loved him simply and genuinely, and with the wholehearted investment of a young woman who had chosen her life and chosen her partner and poured herself into both. She had not loved him thunderously or obsessively, or with the fever-pitch romantic intensity that novels described, but she had loved him truly, and his death had broken something in her that was still not entirely healed. But she was 27 years old and she was not dead. And she had been thinking about Jeremiah Lockhart with a frequency and a warmth that had moved well beyond admiration for a man who had repaired her wagon. She thought about the way he listened. The way he had come to the doctor's office because he'd heard she was there. The way he sat with the twins without any performance of it. The way he had said the sky looked like freedom and known that she would understand what he meant. The way he had said good night and used her name. She thought about Etta Lockhart, who had died in 1879, who had been loved in a house that still carried the shape of her absence in its bare walls and uncurtained windows. She was not a woman who did things impulsively or without thought. She was a woman who had crossed half a country alone with 2 toddlers on $43 because she had assessed her situation and made the best decision she could, and then executed it with both hands and all her attention. She did not throw herself at things. She considered them. She had considered Jeremiah Lockhart from every angle she could think of, and from every angle she arrived at the same conclusion. When the children woke up, she got them dressed and took them to Sunday services, and she sat in the pew and she sang the hymns, and Jeremiah was already there this time, not late, 2 pews to her left, and she did not avoid looking at him. He looked back. After the service, while the congregation gathered in the churchyard, she walked over to him with a directness that she felt rather than planned. "I would like to invite you to supper," she said, "at the Grubers, with the Grubers present, so there is nothing improper about it." He looked at her for a moment. "When?" he asked. "Saturday," she said, "if that suits you." "It does," he said. She nodded. He nodded. Clara arrived at this point and attached herself to his leg again, and he looked down at her with that quiet, unperformed warmth, and Etta thought, all right then. The Saturday supper was different from the August one because this time everyone at the table knew that it was different, including the people who were pretending not to notice. Werner conducted himself with magnificent dignity, engaging Jeremiah in a long discussion about cattle breeding. Margaret served 4 courses and a pie and kept her expression of serene innocence so consistently that it became almost theatrical. But after supper, this time, Etta walked with Jeremiah to the porch rather than returning to the kitchen, and they sat in 2 chairs in the blue evening light and talked while the cicadas started up in the mesquite trees and the sky moved through its colors overhead. He told her about Etta. He did it without being asked and without excessive ceremony, in the direct way that she had come to recognize as entirely characteristic of him. "Her name was Etta Marsh before we married. She was from Richmond, like me. We married in 1876, came west the following year." He paused. "She was brave, braver than me in some ways, or at least she never showed fear even when I knew she had it. When she died I did not." He stopped, started again. "I did not know how to understand a house without her in it. I still have not entirely worked that out." She thought of his house, the bare walls, the uncurtained windows. "I know something about that," she said quietly. "I know you do," he said. "I think that is one of the things that." He stopped again. "One of the things that what?" she asked. He looked at her in the evening light. "One of the things that makes you easier to talk to than most people," he said. She sat with that for a moment. "Jeremiah," she said, "I am not going to pretend that I don't notice what is happening here because I think we are both too old and have both been through too much to pretend about things." He was very still. "I notice it," she said. "I find you remarkable, and I am frightened by that because I have lost one person I loved and I know what that costs, and I did not come to Texas looking for this. But here it is anyway." He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. "I have been afraid to say anything," he said. "Because of the children, partly. I did not want to be something additional and difficult in a situation that is already hard for you. The children are not something to protect me from," she said. "They are Clara and Caleb. They have already attached themselves to your ankles twice." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted fundamentally. "Etta," he said, just her name the way he'd said it once before, only now with a different weight to it. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly. If you are willing." She thought about $43 and a broken wagon and a road through the Texas heat, and she thought about a man who had fixed the wheel before he'd even asked her name, because it needed fixing and she needed help, and that was simply what a person did. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Courting in Dusty Creek in 1882 was conducted with the full and cheerful scrutiny of the entire community, which was simply the nature of small-town life and had to be accepted as part of the arrangement. Every time Jeremiah rode out to the Gruber farm on a Sunday afternoon, every time he and Etta were observed walking together after church, every time he tipped his hat to her with even a fraction more warmth than he tipped it to others, it was noted and discussed at length by the full population of the town. Etta found this annoying in principle and manageable in practice. She had spent enough time in the dress shop listening to Dusty Creek's social machinery to understand that it was mostly affectionate, and that the general opinion of Jeremiah Lockhart was high enough that most people were pleased rather than censorious. What she had not anticipated was how completely natural it would feel. He came on Sunday afternoons and they walked, when the heat permitted it, along the creek that gave the town its name, which was mostly dry this time of year but still beautiful in the particular way of dry Texas creek beds, all bleached stone and dusty green cottonwood. He pushed Caleb in a small wooden wagon he had made, which he brought with him the third Sunday without announcement or fanfare, and which reduced Caleb to an expression of absolute reverence, because it had perfectly shaped wheels that did not wobble, and Caleb was already, at 2 years old, a connoisseur of wheels. "You made that," she said. "It took about 2 hours," he said, which was not the point and he knew it. "Jeremiah." "He kept looking at my workbench," he said, a little defensively, and she laughed again, and she was finding that laughing around Jeremiah was becoming something she had to make no effort to do, which was a novelty she had not expected. Clara had at some point in September begun calling him Jerry, which was an abbreviation he seemed to regard with a mixture of bemusement and helpless acceptance. He did not correct her. He corrected almost nothing where the children were concerned, which told Etta a great deal about both his patience and his genuine feeling. She visited his house for the first time in October with Werner and Margaret as chaperones, and she saw it properly for the first time, the clean solidity of it, the good craftsmanship in the built-in shelves and the fireplace mantel, the quality of the tools in the workshop, the care visible in every board and fitting. She also saw, for the first time, the small framed photograph on the mantel. A young woman in a light-colored dress, dark-haired, with a serious expression that was almost but not quite suppressing a smile. Eleanor Lockhart, who had been brave and who had died too young. Etta looked at it for a long time. "I want you to know," she said to Jeremiah quietly, while Werner and Margaret were in the kitchen with Mrs. Alvarez, "that I do not expect you to put that away. I would not want you to." He stood beside her, looking at the photograph. "She would have liked you," he said. "She had no patience for pretense either." That was, Etta thought, one of the finest things anyone had ever said to her. October deepened and the Texas autumn came in, which was less dramatic than the Missouri autumn she had known but beautiful in its own way. The light going golden and the heat easing, and the nights becoming something you could actually walk out into without feeling assaulted. The twins turned 2.5 and developed strong, competing opinions about everything, which made daily life simultaneously more difficult and more entertaining. Jeremiah was at the birthday gathering Margaret organized, sitting on the porch steps with Caleb asleep against his shoulder, while Clara demonstrated her dancing technique to an appreciative audience of Gruber children, and the image of him with Etta's sleeping son against his shoulder printed itself somewhere so deep in her memory that she knew she would carry it for the rest of her life. She walked over and sat down on the step beside him. "He goes to sleep on people he trusts," she said quietly. "He did not do that with anyone for months after Thomas died." Jeremiah looked down at the small sleeping weight against his shoulder and then at her. "I want to marry you," he said, just like that, no preamble, no ornamentation, the way he always said the important things. I want you to know that. I'm not going to ask yet because I think you need more time and because you have not been here long enough to be certain of anything. But I want you to know that I intend to ask." She sat very still on the porch step. "And when you do ask," she said carefully, "my answer will also concern Clara and Caleb." "I know," he said. "That is not in addition to my reasons. They are part of them." She looked at him. He was looking down at Caleb with that steady, unperformative warmth. "All right," she said. "Then I want you to know that my answer when you ask will be yes." He looked up from Caleb to her, and she saw for just a moment before he got his expression back under control what it had cost him to live in that bare house for 3 years and what it might mean to have it not be bare anymore. She leaned her head against his shoulder, his free shoulder. It was, she thought, exactly the right fit. He asked her in November, formally and properly, with Werner and Margaret present because those were the conventions of the time and place, and because Etta had come to regard them as the closest thing to family she had, and because Jeremiah Lockhart, for all that he was a plain-speaking, unsentimental man, understood that some things deserved ceremony. He had a ring. It had been his grandmother's, he told her, brought from Virginia in the bottom of a trunk. It was a simple gold band with a small garnet, and it was, Etta thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever been given. She said yes. She had told him she would, but there was something different about saying it with the ring between them and the lamplight on his face and Werner pretending to look at the ceiling and Margaret crying with zero shame. He put the ring on her finger. She kept her eyes on his face. "Thank you," she said, which was not what people said in this moment, but it was what she meant, and he was a man who understood what she meant. "Thank you," he said back, and she knew that he was also saying what he meant. They were married on the 15th of December, 1882, in the Dusty Creek Church, in a service conducted by Reverend Mills that was attended by what appeared to be the entire population of the surrounding county, because a wedding in a small town in 1882 was a community occasion as much as a private one, and because both the bride and the groom had enough friends and goodwill to fill every pew. Mrs. Alvarez cried and denied it afterward with magnificent conviction. Werner walked Etta down the aisle at her request, his face red and his eyes suspiciously bright. Clara and Caleb were held by Margaret's oldest girl, Clara in a white dress that she had already attempted to untie twice during the processional, Caleb in a small suit that he had been persuaded to wear by being told that Jeremiah would be wearing one also. Jeremiah was already at the front of the church when she came in, and he turned when the door opened, and she watched his face when he saw her, and the quality of that look, the particular way a careful, controlled man looked when he let himself feel something without managing it, was something she would keep forever. She walked toward him through the light and the faces of her new community, and when she reached him he took her hand in both of his and she thought, "Here. This is where the new life starts." The ring joined her grandmother's ring on her left hand, and Reverend Mills said the words, and she said her part, and Jeremiah said his with the same directness and certainty he brought to everything. And when it was done, the church broke into the particular joyful noise of people who have been waiting a long time for something good to happen. They walked out of the church into the December light, Etta's hand on Jeremiah's arm, and Clara immediately detached from Margaret's oldest girl and attached herself to Jeremiah's leg. And Caleb said, "Jerry," and lifted his arms. And Jeremiah picked him up without breaking stride. And Etta looked at the three of them, the man she had married and the 2 children she had made with Thomas, and she felt the grief and the joy existing side by side in her chest in the way that she had learned they could. Not one erasing the other, but both of them real and both of them hers. Thomas would have been glad for this, she thought. He had been a good man. Good men wanted good things for the people they loved. Moving into Jeremiah's house was an experience that Etta undertook with the same organized efficiency she brought to everything, but which surprised her with its emotional dimensions. She had boxes of her own things, a modest collection but more than it might have been, and she had the twins' things, and she had the particular challenge of integrating her history with his in a space that had been his alone for years. He had told her, "Change what you want." She had taken him at his word. Curtains went up in the windows. A braided rug went down in the front room, one she had made herself through October and November with Margaret's help, the hours of working it somehow becoming part of the preparation for this. The twins had a room of their own that Jeremiah had expanded and fitted with 2 small beds and built-in shelves, and he had put the same perfectly wheeled small wagon from the porch of the Gruber farm on Caleb's shelf, with the same absence of announcement that characterized all his gifts. Aliner's photograph remained on the mantel. Etta had put it there herself when she moved things around. Jeremiah had seen her do it and had not said anything, but he had found her hand and held it briefly, and that had been the end of any conversation that needed to be had about it. Mrs. Alvarez transitioned from housekeeper to general authority figure, with a smoothness that suggested she had been waiting for someone to share the house with, and she and Etta developed a working arrangement that was part mutual respect and part ongoing negotiation about who controlled the kitchen. On Christmas morning, Jeremiah gave the twins a wooden rocking horse he had been making in the workshop for weeks, a proper one, smooth finished and well balanced, with a real leather saddle. It was the kind of toy that took serious skill and serious time to make, and Clara and Caleb looked at it with the stunned reverence of children who had received something better than they had even known to ask for. Etta gave him books, a full set, 4 of them, history and natural philosophy, from the selection in the general store that she had been quietly compiling since October. He had mentioned over the course of their many conversations that he had owned more books before the move west and had not replaced them, and she had listened and she had remembered. He held the books for a long time without speaking. "Etta," he said finally. "Merry Christmas," she said. He set the books down very carefully on the side table, and he looked at her with the full open expression she had now seen several times, the one that meant he had stopped managing how much he felt. Then he crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her, which he had done before, but not quite like this, not with quite this degree of frank, unheld feeling. The twins, on their rocking horse, were fully absorbed in an argument about whose turn it was that required no adult intervention. She kissed him back with everything she had. January of 1883 was cold, cold in the sharp, clear way the Texas high country could be in winter, with frost on the ground at dawn and ice on the water troughs, and the kind of sky that was so deeply blue it seemed to have been painted. Etta had settled into her new life with a completeness that occasionally surprised her by its depth. She still worked 3 days a week at Mrs. Pierce's shop, because she was good at it, and because she liked having her own purpose and income, and Jeremiah had made no suggestion that she should do otherwise. The land adjacent to the Grubers came up for final sale in January, and Jeremiah bought it. He told her at breakfast one morning with the same lack of theatrical presentation he brought to everything, saying simply that he'd heard it was going to be sold to a cattle operation out of San Antonio, and he had put in an offer because he thought she might want to have it, as additional land for their own operation. She put down her coffee cup and looked at him. "You bought land because you thought I might want it," she said. "We could run cattle on the north pasture and put kitchen garden on the lower plot," he said, apparently under the impression that this was a practical conversation. "And it keeps us next to Werner and Margaret, which matters." "Jeremiah," he looked at her. "You bought land because you thought it would make me happy," she said. He looked slightly uncomfortable, in the way he always looked when she named something he was doing that he had not intended to be named. "It is a good investment," he said. She leaned across the table and kissed him on the cheek. He was still not entirely accustomed to spontaneous demonstrations of affection, which she had decided was one of the things she most enjoyed about being married to him, the visible way each one landed somewhere real. "It is also a good investment," she agreed. The new land changed things in ways both practical and symbolic. It was theirs in a way the house hadn't quite been yet, because the house had been his alone first. The new land was chosen together, planned together, worked together through the spring and into the summer. Jeremiah taught her things about the land she had not known. She brought to it an organizational intelligence and a physical stamina that impressed him in ways he occasionally expressed in the direct, unembellished way she had come to prize enormously. "You are good at this," he said to her one evening in April, sitting on the porch after a day of fencing work, his boots off and his eyes tired in the satisfied way of a man who has done real work. "At fencing," she said. "All of it," he said. He was looking out across the land, the particular golden-brown Texas evening light making everything softer. "At building something, you are not afraid of the hard parts." "I am afraid of them," she said. "I simply do not let the fear make decisions." He looked at her sidelong. "Where did you learn that?" "From necessity," she said, "and from my father a little. He used to say that courage is not the absence of fear, it is fear doing what needs to be done." "Smart man." "He was," she said. "You would have liked him." They sat in the evening light with the sounds of the twins inside, the normal sounds of two small children being managed toward bedtime by Mrs. Alvarez with the calm authority of long practice, the sounds of a house that was lived in, that had noise and motion and people in it. "Jeremiah," she said, "I am going to have a baby." The silence was brief and complete. He turned and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before on his face, something so layered and complex that she could not read all of it, only the parts that were joy and the parts that were fear and the parts that were the particular private thing that was entirely his own and that she was still learning to name. "When?" he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "October, if I have the arithmetic right," she said. "I have been to Dr. Hennessy." He took her hand. He held it with both of his, looking down at it, and she could feel the way he was working through something, the effort of it, the necessary confrontation with what he had lost and what it meant to stand at this threshold again. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. He looked up from her hand to her face. "Yes," he said. "I am." He stopped, started again. "I am glad, I am afraid, I am both of those things very much." "That is honest," she said. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it in precisely those words, and it came out with the quality of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being said aloud for the first time because this was the moment that required it. "I should have said that before this." "I knew it," she said, "but I am glad you said it." "I love you," he said again, and it sounded like a man finding that saying a thing twice makes it more real, not less. "I love you too," she said. "I have for quite a long time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "October." "October," she confirmed. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, and she felt it everywhere. The summer of 1883 was busy in the way that frontier summers always were, full of work and heat, and the ongoing project of making a life in a place that required your full attention, and then some. The twins were growing into distinct and formidable personalities. Clara was talky and opinionated, and had strong feelings about the color of her dresses and the correct way to eat corn. Caleb was quieter but stubborn in a deep, geological way that could not be moved by argument, only by long, patient negotiation. They had begun calling Jeremiah Papa, which had happened gradually, and then all at once in the way children decide things. He had not prompted it or requested it. He had, Etta suspected, been somewhat ambushed by his own reaction to it the first time it happened, because she had seen his face in that unguarded moment, and she had very carefully not made it remarkable, because she understood that he needed to feel it without being observed. But she had felt it too. She had felt it in her chest like a bell. He was good with them, profoundly and naturally good, in a way that was not about performance but about genuine attention. He taught Caleb the names of tools with the seriousness of a craftsman passing down knowledge, which Caleb received with equal gravity. He made up stories for Clara that were elaborate and episodic, featuring a horse named Stanley who had philosophical objections to being ridden and a dog named something different every time, and Clara corrected him every time when the dog's name changed, and he received the corrections with perfect mock contrition. Etta watched all of this from the various places and angles of a busy household and thought, "This is the thing I did not know to hope for. This exact thing." Dr. Hennessy had told her that the pregnancy was progressing well, that she was healthy and strong, and that the autumn would tell the rest. She was not frightened in the way she might have been, partly because she was constitutionally inclined toward addressing facts rather than fears, and partly because she had Jeremiah, who was frightened enough for both of them in the quiet, careful way he had, which manifested in him being in the same room with her a great deal more than was strictly necessary. She had pointed this out to him in June. "You are watching me," she said, not critically. "I am in the workshop," he said. "The workshop that is directly outside this window," she said, "where you can see me clearly. You move the bench." He looked at the bench, which was indeed positioned with a clear sightline to the kitchen window. He looked at her. "The light is better here," he said. "Jeremiah." "I know," he said. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands. "I know I am aware that I am not managing this in a fully rational manner." "You are managing it in a very tender manner," she said, "and I appreciate it, but I am quite well and Mrs. Alvarez is here, and Dr. Hennessy says everything is proceeding normally, and I need you to not exhaust yourself with worry about something that is going well." He looked at her, she looked at him. "I cannot help it," he said, with a plain, stripped honesty that she recognized as what he did when he had stopped trying to manage his own presentation. "I know," she said. "But let me help with that." She crossed to him and put her hand against his jaw. "Talk to me when you are afraid. Do not carry it around inside the workshop." He put his hand over hers. He closed his eyes briefly. "All right," he said. They talked that evening on the porch the way they did most evenings, with the July stars coming out over Texas and the twins asleep inside. He told her about Alina more than he had before, the particular shape of what had happened, the way the joy had turned so quickly into loss. He told her about the days after, the way the house had felt, the months of going through motions. She listened. She did not try to fix it or argue it away. She just listened and held his hand and let him speak until he was done. "The thing that helps," he said when he had finished, "is that you are not afraid. You are not pretending not to be afraid. You genuinely are not afraid." "I am cautiously optimistic," she said, "which is my natural state." He smiled, the full version, the one that changed his face. "I am cautiously optimistic too," he said. Now. September turned into October, and the air cooled and sharpened. And on the night of the 23rd of October, 1883, Etta Hawthorne Lockhart gave birth to a son in the room she shared with her husband, with Mrs. Alvarez and Margaret Gruber present and Dr. Hennessy attending and Jeremiah sitting directly outside the door for 3 hours because Dr. Hennessy had suggested this was preferable to him being inside, where he was, in the doctor's professional assessment, not a useful presence. The boy was healthy and loud and had a remarkable amount of dark hair, and he arrived in the world with the air of someone who had urgent opinions and intended to express them immediately. They named him Samuel Thomas Lockhart. Thomas for Etta's first husband, because that seemed right, because Clara and Caleb had needed something acknowledged. Jeremiah held his son for the first time in the early hours of a Texas October morning, with the lamp burning low and Etta finally asleep after 3 hours of labor, and Margaret Gruber, who had no business staying this late, was still there and watching from the doorway and would cry about it later with great contentment. He held the baby and looked at him for a long time. Then he looked up and met Margaret's eyes. "He looks like her," he said quietly, meaning Etta. "He does," said Margaret. "Good," said Jeremiah. Samuel Thomas Lockhart grew and prospered and hollered and ate and grew some more, and the household adjusted to accommodate him with the particular, creative chaos of a family absorbing a new member. Clara was fascinated and possessive. Caleb was deeply concerned about whether the baby was doing things correctly, which was an expression of his personality that Etta found both very funny and very recognizable. Jeremiah was with the baby the same thing he was with the twins, present, patient, genuine. He was perhaps even more careful in the first weeks, in ways that reflected what it had cost him to arrive here. But as the weeks passed and Samuel continued to be stubbornly, energetically alive and loud about it, the careful quality eased into something simpler. Etta watched him one evening in late November, sitting in the chair by the fire with Samuel on his chest and Caleb on one side and Clara on the other, and she thought of a different evening in a different place, a wagon on a broken road and a man who had crouched down to be at eye level with her children. He had fixed the wagon first. He had fixed his heart second. She had fixed hers too, in a different order and with different tools, and here they were, in a warm house in Texas with 3 children and a yellow dog, and a life that neither of them could have planned from the wreckage they'd both been standing in. Mrs. Alvarez brought her a cup of coffee and made the small noise that was her version of commenting on the scene, and Etta drank her coffee and looked at her family and felt the kind of happiness that is not loud or dramatic but is very, very deep. The year turned toward 1884 and the winter settled in, and the life of the Lockhart household settled into the particular rhythms of a family that has found its shape. Jeremiah's business continued to grow. He had taken on an apprentice, a 16-year-old named Diego Alvarez, who was Mrs. Alvarez's nephew and had hands that were made for metalwork. The stage line contract expanded. Jeremiah was, quietly and without any apparent ambition for recognition, becoming the most reliable craftsman in the county. Etta had reduced her days at Mrs. Pierce's shop to 2, because 3 children required time, but she had begun doing some of the more complex dressmaking work at home, the evening gowns and wedding dresses that required extended fitting and considerable skill, and this suited her better than the shop hours and paid better too. She realized at some point in February of 1884, become a woman of genuine means and standing in a community she had not known 18 months ago. She had come to Texas with $43 and a broken wagon. She had a home, a husband, 3 children, a piece of land, an income, and a community. She had made this. With Jeremiah, yes, but the Etta who had stood on that road in the Texas heat and assessed her situation and made the best decision she could, that woman was the foundation of everything. She told Jeremiah this on a Sunday afternoon in March, sitting on the porch while Samuel slept inside and the twins raced around the yard with the yellow dog. She told him about the $43 which she had never mentioned before and about what she had been thinking as she'd stood looking at the broken wagon. He listened to the whole thing. "What did you decide?" he said when she had finished. "When you were standing there by the wagon." "I decided that crying was not useful," she said, "and that there was a sound of hammering from approximately 200 yards away." He looked at her sideways. "That is how you ended up at my workshop," he said. "That is how I ended up at your workshop." He was quiet for a moment. "I was fixing a wheel hub when you arrived," he said. "I heard you coming through the grass. I heard you before I saw you." "You did not seem surprised." "I was surprised," he said. "I was extremely surprised. I just did not show it." "No," she said. "You don't show things, not at first." "I showed you eventually," he said. "You did," she agreed. Clara had fallen down in the yard and was now conducting a detailed audit of her injuries to an uninterested audience of dog and brother. Samuel made a small sound from inside that suggested he was about to become much louder. The March sky was an extraordinary blue above the mesquite trees. "I am glad you walked across that field," he said. "I am glad you had a workshop with the doors open," she said. He took her hand. They sat on the porch in the Texas afternoon, listening to their children's sounds, and Etta thought about the story the 2 of them would tell each other and their children for the rest of their lives. The story of the broken wagon and the wheelwright and the $43. The story of a man who had fixed the wheel before he'd even asked her name, because the wheel needed fixing, and that was simply what you did. He had fixed the wagon first. He had fixed his heart second, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that she had fixed it, just as he had fixed hers. the two of them working at the same repair from different sides, with different tools, meeting somewhere in the middle in a workshop that smelled of iron and sawdust and linseed oil. It was, Etta Hawthorne Lockhart decided, a very good story. Clara came charging up the porch steps, past whatever injury had detained her, and launched herself between them on the bench with the absolute confidence of a child who knows she will be received. And Jeremiah caught her with one arm and pulled her into the space between them without releasing Etta's hand. "Tell the Stanley story," Clara demanded, by which she meant the horse story. "You have heard it 40 times, Jeremiah said. "Tell it again," said Clara. He told it again. He changed the dog's name, as he always did, and Clara corrected him, and Etta sat in the sun with her daughter between her and her husband and listened to his voice. And from inside the house came the specific escalating sounds of Samuel deciding that the nap was over. And from the yard came Caleb's voice asking the dog an unanswerable question. And from somewhere far off came the sound of Werner Gruber's wagon on the road, which meant that Margaret was probably with him. Which meant there would be coffee and company this evening. The sun moved across the Texas sky. The horse named Stanley had philosophical objections to being ridden. The dog had a name that kept changing. Etta held her husband's hand and listened to her children and felt, in the deep, unshowy way she felt everything important, that this was what $43 and a broken wheel and 200 yards of scrub grass had been leading to, all along, and she would not change a single mile of the road that had brought her here. Caleb appeared at the bottom of the porch steps with the yellow dog at his heels and both hands full of some important collection of rocks, and looked up at his family on the porch. "Papa," he announced, "the fence by the water trough is broke." "I'll look at it tomorrow," said Jeremiah. "You always fix the broke things," Caleb said, with simple and complete approval. Jeremiah looked down at him, and then across Clara's head at Etta, and his face had the full open expression that she had first seen on their wedding day, and that she saw now with a regularity that she considered the truest measure of everything they had built together. "That is what I do," he said. He was not talking about the fence. Samuel's cries from inside reached a volume that required response, and Etta stood and went inside to her son, and she heard behind her Clara demanding the next part of the story and Jeremiah resuming it without missing a beat, and she picked up her boy from his cradle and held him against her shoulder and stood at the window and looked out at the porch, at the man she had married reading a made-up story to the daughter she had made with someone else, at Caleb coming up the steps with his rocks, at the yellow dog settling at Jeremiah's feet with a sigh of pure contentment. She pressed her cheek against Samuel's dark hair. "Your father," she told him quietly, meaning Jeremiah, meaning the man on the porch who fixed things and did not show what he felt until you had made him feel it enough that he had to, "is a remarkable man." Samuel, who was 6 months old and had opinions only about hunger and sleep, burped in a way that she chose to interpret as agreement. She laughed, there in the afternoon light of the room that was now entirely her home, and through the window she heard Jeremiah pause the story at her laugh, as he always did when he heard it, as if it were something worth stopping for. It was, she thought. It absolutely was. The summer of 1884 came in with its usual Texas ferocity, but Etta had long since made her peace with Texas summers, had come to understand that the heat and the sky and the dry wind were part of the same bargain as the extraordinary light and the enormous nights and the feeling of space that had looked like freedom when she first saw it. You could not have one without the other. That was the nature of most things worth having. Jeremiah had begun teaching Caleb that summer the basic principles of metalwork, very simple things, how the forge worked, why iron behaved as it did under heat, the name and function of each tool in careful order. Caleb was 3.5 and absorbed all of it with the focused solemnity of someone learning a language they already partially knew. Diego watched this and grinned. Mrs. Alvarez watched it from the kitchen door and did not deny that she found it pleasing. Clara, who had observed several of these lessons with an expression of evaluative interest, announced in July that she also wished to learn the forge, a statement that was received with full seriousness by Jeremiah, who said that she would learn when her hands were bigger, which was the same answer he had given Caleb, and who then spent an afternoon teaching her instead how to properly set a mortise joint in wood, which she accomplished with real aptitude and considerable pride. Etta had watched this particular afternoon from the workshop door, and she had thought about what it meant to have a daughter who was taught that she could learn these things, who had a father who assumed she could. The world outside Dusty Creek was not always like this. She had grown up in a time and place that had more limitations than this workshop on a summer afternoon, and she was grateful, with a specific and political gratitude, for the small and large freedoms that could be built within a life if you were careful and intentional about it. She was expecting again. She had told Jeremiah in June, and he had received this news with the visibly easier quality of a man who now had evidence that this could go well, that the fear and the joy could coexist, and that the joy was capable of being louder. "Another one," he had said, with a warmth in his voice that made the simple words into something much more. "Another one," she had confirmed. "Then we will need another shelf in the children's room," he had said, and she had recognized this as his version of saying, I am so glad I am building a shelf because this is what I know how to do with the feeling." Build the shelf, she had told him. He had built the shelf that same week. It was, she thought, the most beautiful shelf she had ever seen. The baby came in February of 1885, a girl this time, dark-eyed and loud, and with a grip that Dr. Hennessy described with professional admiration as truly impressive. They named her Ruth Eleanor Lockhart, the Eleanor for the woman in the photograph on the mantel, which was Jeremiah's suggestion, made quietly and not without its own weight. Etta had held his hand when he suggested it and said yes without hesitation, because Eleanor Lockhart had been brave and had loved this man and had made him something that grief had then tried to unmake, and naming a child for her was not a shadow but a gift. Jeremiah held Ruth on the morning after she was born, and Etta watched him hold her, and the expression on his face was one of such complete and unguarded happiness that she had to look away for a moment, because some things are too private to observe for too long, even when you are the person most responsible for them. The twins were 4 now, old enough to understand that the baby was a person and not merely a phenomenon, and Clara immediately appointed herself Ruth's primary supervisor, a role she conducted with great dedication and some excess of enthusiasm that had to be gently managed. Caleb looked at Ruth with the thoughtful assessment of an engineer examining a new project, and then announced that she had good hands, which was, coming from Caleb, high praise. The house that had been bare and still 3 years ago was now full in the way that only a house with 4 children could be full of sound and movement, and the perpetual mild chaos of people growing and learning and disagreeing about things, and figuring them out again. Mrs. Alvarez presided over this with the calm authority of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, and Jeremiah came in every evening from the workshop to find the controlled disorder of a genuinely lived-in life, and looked, Etta thought, like a man who had not known what he was waiting for until it arrived. In the spring of 1885, Dusty Creek held its first proper county fair, organized by the Ladies' Charitable Society, of which Etta was now a member, and featuring livestock judging and a pie contest and a quilting exhibition, and several other activities that required the combined organizational energy of most of the county's female population for approximately 6 months. Jeremiah entered the ironwork competition and won it, which surprised no one including him, and he accepted the blue ribbon from the competition judge with the modest directness that was his register for public situations. That evening, at the fair supper, he sat across from Etta at a long table with the children between them and Werner and Margaret and Mrs. Alvarez and Diego and half the county at the tables around them, and the lanterns were lit in the summer dark, and someone was playing a fiddle somewhere near the back. And Clara was asleep against Jeremiah's arm, and Caleb was asleep against Etta's. And Samuel was in Werner's lap conducting a detailed investigation of Werner's pocket watch. And Ruth was in Margaret's arms being cooed at with enthusiastic German endearments. Jeremiah looked across the children and the dishes and the candle and the noise of the community at Etta, and his face was open and warm and entirely without reserve, the face of a man who had long since stopped managing what showed. "What are you thinking?" she asked, because she always asked, because she liked hearing the answer. "I am thinking," he said, "that I was fixing a wheel hub when you walked into my workshop, and that if I had finished the job 5 minutes earlier I would have been elsewhere and you would have walked past." "I would not have walked past," she said. "I heard your hammer from the road. I would have found you." He looked at her with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who knew what he knew. "I know," he said. "I think you would have." The fiddle played. The lanterns burned. Samuel made a lunge for Werner's pocket watch and almost succeeded. Clara shifted in her sleep against Jeremiah's arm and settled again with a sigh of total contentment. Etta Hawthorne Lockhart looked at her husband across the table full of their life and thought about broken wagons and open doors and the sound of a hammer in the Texas afternoon, and she felt the deep, unshowy happiness that had become the ground of her days, the thing beneath all the noise and work and chaos that held everything up. He had fixed the wagon first. And in doing so, without knowing it, he had fixed the road that led to all of this. She reached across the sleeping children and took his hand, there in the lantern light with their community around them and the fiddle playing and the Texas sky enormous and full of stars above, and he held it with both of his, the way he always did, and she thought, "This is the whole story. This is all of it, and it is more than enough. It is everything. It is the thing the sky looked like when she first saw it. It looked like freedom. It looked like home.